Thank you so much for joining us. Rachel and I are really excited to tell you the story about how GitHub and the Visual Studio Code team at Microsoft are collaborating to bring you a free, open source GitHub extension in VS Code. First, I'd like to introduce you to the team. From Microsoft, we have Rachel, Peng, Kai, and Kenneth. And from GitHub, we have Shauna, Ashi, and myself, Sarah. And if you're here at Universe locally, we'd love for you to come say hi to the four of us who are walking around. Chat with us, let us know what you think. Wrong clicker. Before we get started on telling you the story about how we built this extension, we're going to show you what you actually can do if you install it today from the VS Code Marketplace.
So as Sarah said, my name is Rachel. I'm an engineer working at Microsoft on VS Code. And I'm really excited to show you what we've created. So this extension is actually already available in the Marketplace. So if I go to the extensions viewlet within VS Code, I can search for pull request and find the GitHub pull requests extension. You'll notice that it has this preview tag. So this means that we may continue to iterate on the UI, and there are still things we'd like to add to the extension. But it currently is stable, and you can go download it and use it right now. So I've actually already installed it to my machine. So the first thing I'd like to do is sign into GitHub. And I can do that in one of two ways. I can either use the status bar item at the bottom, or I can use the command palette. So I'm asked to authorize Visual Studio Code. And after I complete this auth dance, I get a notification saying that I'm signed in. And the status bar item has now updated to be my username. So I have open in VS Code an actual fork of the extension code. So today we're going to use the PR extension to review a PR for the PR extension. So where do I go within VS Code to find information about pull requests? Well, if you're familiar with VS Code, you know that the source control viewlet houses information related to source control. So this is where I go to stage and commit changes. And we thought this was a great place to put this new GitHub pull requests view. So this has a number of categories that roughly match those that you see on github.com. Now this is around the time in the morning when I like to look at pull requests that are assigned to me. So let's do that. It looks like my coworker Peng has been hard at work and has created 2 pull requests today. So let's dive into these. As soon as I expand the pull request node, I see a description node and a list of file changes associated with the pull request. Clicking on the description node gives me more information about the pull request, including the description, any commits, any comments on it. And from here, I can also add more comments directly to the pull request. I can also jump directly to github.com from this page. So we see the exact same information is displayed here. So what is this pull request actually about? Here, Peng says that he's adding an avatar to the commits tree. So let's take a look at the file changes. As soon as I click on a file change, a diff editor opens, just as it would for any other type of file change within VS Code. One thing that's important to note is this change is not actually local to my machine. At this point, we're essentially browsing GitHub. So the extension is fetching the diff from GitHub and constructing the entire file view for us. One thing that's new to the UI is this white gutter margin. So this indicates exactly where I can add comments within the editor. If you're familiar with pull requests on github.com, you know that you're limited to commenting in and around changes. And since we're using the same API, we have the same limitation. So here, Peng has added an icon path property, and he's set it to be the commit author's avatar URL. This looks great to me, so I want to add a comment. You'll notice as soon as I started adding the comment, a decoration appeared in the gutter. This diamond decoration indicates where comments are, and it can be used to collapse and expand comments. So I feel really good about this change, and I actually want to go approve it. If I go back to the description page, I can do just that. So I can approve, I can request changes, I can close or merge the pull request from here. I'll approve it. So now I want to prove to you that I did actually just do this. So let's go back to github.com. And you'll see that my comment has been added, and I've approved the changes. All right, let's take a look at the next pull request. This one looks like it might be a little bit more involved. It's got quite a few file changes. So Pung says this is a work in progress, and he has some questions that he wants me to answer. I can scroll down the description page and see what exactly these questions are. I'd really like to be able to navigate to the file with comments by just clicking on this. But as I said, this is still a preview version of the extension, so currently we don't have this. In fact, this is something we would love to see a PR for if you feel inspired. So since I'm not able to navigate here, I'll instead go back to the File Changes view. So you'll notice that some of these files have diamond decorations next to them. This indicates what files have comments on them. Clicking on this once again opens a diff view, and I'm scrolled immediately to the comment. So here Pung is asking, should we be using uri.parse or uri.file? I remember that one of these takes a path as the argument, and the other one takes the complete URI. I can't remember which is which, though. So I'd really like to be able to go to definition. But as I said earlier, these changes aren't local to my machine, so I'm not able to do that right now. But if I go back to the description page, I can either use this checkout button or this context menu item to actually check out the pull request. So by doing this, I now have a local branch that is that pull request branch. So I have all of those changes to review. And you'll notice that two things changed in the UI when I did that. First, I now have a changes in pull request view. So since we're looking at a particular branch associated with a pull request, we really want to focus in on that. So this once again shows the list of files, as well as the list of commits. So this is what Pung was adding an avatar to earlier. The second piece of the UI that's been added is this comments panel. So this gives me an overview of all of the comments within my workspace. And from here, I can easily navigate to them. If you're the person who submitted the PR, this could also act as a sort of to-do list of things you might need to fix. So let's click on this comment, and I'm immediately navigated to it within the file. And now I'm able to go to definition. So I can scroll up, and I see that uri.file treats its argument as a path. So I know that that's the correct thing to use here. So what's really great about this box here is that it's not just a text area. This is, in and of itself, a small editor, which means that we support Markdown and syntax highlighting. So I can add a block comment, and you see that the syntax highlighting is correct. All right, one question down. Let's look at the next question. Here, Pung asks what we should do when this lookup fails. And we should throw an error. Since I'm already typing, I can actually use a keyboard shortcut to submit this comment, which is Command-Enter, exactly as you would on github.com, or Control-Enter if you're using Windows or Linux. So while I'm in this file, I see that there's a suspicious red squiggly here. Mousing over it, I see that tslint is complaining about consecutive blank lines. So once again, since these changes are local, all of my linters are running, and I can see that there's a problem here. So I'll ask Pung if his linter is enabled. If I wanted to, I could actually directly make changes to this file. So I can delete this line myself, and I'll see that that change shows up on top of the current changes. So if I wanted to, I could actually commit that and then push it to the branch. But instead, I want to explore what would happen if Pung was also making changes to this while I was reviewing it. So what happens if he makes a commit while I have this checked out? And to do that, I'm going to switch quickly to the web UI and edit that same file. So I'll remove that blank line and commit that change. Go back to VS Code. So the extension is polling for updates in the background. So to expedite that process, I'm actually just going to do a refresh right now. And as soon as I've refreshed it, I see this notification telling me that there are updates available for my branch. So I'm able to pull them right in. And you see that the line has now been removed, and I can continue to work. So the same thing applies for people adding comments. If someone adds a comment on github.com or using the extension on their own machine, the extension will pull for those updates and be able to update them automatically within your editor. Great. So I've addressed both of Punk's questions, and I'd now like to leave this sort of review state. How do I do that? Well, how did I get into this state in the first place? All I did was change to a branch that was associated with a pull request. So to leave, all I need to do is check out a different branch. I can do this either by using this exit review mode button on the description page, or I can use any other way that I would normally change branches within VS Code. So I could use the branch selector, or I could use the terminal. So as soon as I check out a different branch, the UI updates automatically. I now no longer have the changes in pull request view, and the comments panel is gone. I'm now in the exact same state I was before I started, and I've completed looking at these two pull requests. So I hope that's given you a sense of what you can do with the extension, and I'll now give it back to Sarah to talk more about the motivation and the background of this extension.
Thanks, Rachel. Are people excited about this? Woo! Come on, yeah. Well, we are. Before we get into where we're going next, I don't know if you've heard, but GitHub really cares about developer workflows. Have y'all heard about that? I don't know, maybe a couple times this week. We really care about developer workflows. And we recognize that developers aren't always in a web page. I know, it's crazy. They also are on a local machine using other tools, other editors, IDEs, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to walk you through what a typical GitHub workflow looks like for developers and point out some of these changes that happen during the workflow. Typically, when you start, you're on github.com. You might be looking through some issues, trying to figure out what you want to solve next, what you want to close out. You might fork the repository, and then you'll head back down to your local environment, and you'll clone and create a branch. Maybe you'll do this in your IDE, maybe you'll do this on command line, or maybe you'll use GitHub Desktop. Then you'll write code. This is pretty well handled by your editor, whether you're using VS Code, Atom, something else. And then you'll actually want to contribute. I don't know why this isn't. Then you'll actually want to contribute your code back to the repository. And the way that you do this on GitHub is by creating a pull request. This is essentially requesting that the changes that you've made on your branch get pulled into the branch that you're targeting. But then something really interesting happens. You have this complex conversation between a contributor and a maintainer. And I say complex because it's not just a series of comments back and forth. For example, the maintainer may want to actually pull down the code and test it, and maybe even help debug something that a contributor is running into. And all this while, the contributor may also still have other features they're developing on this pull request, or other, bits and pieces. And so they may want to be responding to comments coming in from the maintainers. You saw this in the demo. This is a back and forth dance between github.com and your local environment that we're trying to solve the pain point for. And then you might have heard of something about GitHub Actions coming along. This is where we really care about deploying and eventually merging your code and getting it out into the hands of your users. I'd really like to highlight this piece, though, because back in 2015, we were building the GitHub Desktop for Windows app. And our developers were using Visual Studio to build this. And the dance between Visual Studio and github.com was just a huge time suck. We found it very difficult to have two large windows open on one small laptop. And we were doing a lot of communication back and forth using github.com. At that time, we started the GitHub extension for Visual Studio. And today, you can find a similar list of features where we have pull requests. You can check them out, create them, and have inline comments all within your Visual Studio environment. Around the same time, we were building a first-class experience for We were building a first-class experience, GitHub experience for Atom, starting with Git operations, such as cloning, committing, pushing, pulling, syncing, etc. I don't know why this is. I'm just going to stop. And then in 2016, we started exploring another developer workflow, the game developer workflow. Folks using Unity were caring about other things like file locking and Git LFS. So we provided support for that. In 2017, we began thinking about VS Code. VS Code is very important for a lot of open source developers, and we wanted to make sure that we were supporting our GitHub experience where all of our developers are. So we started working on a prototype, and in early 2018, yes, before acquisition announcement, before we ever knew anything, we went and visited Rachel's team up in Redmond and found out that they had a very similar prototype, only they had access to VS Code APIs that were not yet available. So we decided to collaborate on this project. I'm now going to have Rachel tell you a little bit about how Microsoft came to work on this.
So code review was and is a real pain point for our team. If you read our monthly release notes, you see just how many pull requests come in from the community. Last iteration, we merged 212 pull requests in our main repository alone. Many of these required validating these changes locally, so actually checking out the branch, as you saw in the demo, without the checkout button. But at that time, we looked on the extensions marketplace, and nothing gave the end-to-end experience that I just demoed. So we decided that we wanted to bring in code review features to VS Code. And whenever we're adding a new feature to VS Code, the first question we have to answer is, does this belong in the core of VS Code, or should this be implemented as an extension? We can think of code editors as being on a spectrum between pure text editors and heavyweight IDEs. And we want VS Code to be in the sweet spot between these. That is, we want it to be as lightweight as possible, while still maintaining the best support for the developer's inner loop, the cycle of coding, building, and testing. When we first discussed the code review features, it quickly became apparent that this should be implemented as an extension. For some of our users, code review was part of their inner loop. It was something they did every day. But for others, it wasn't. And secondly, and this may shock you, but we've heard that not everyone uses GitHub to do it. So we wanted to be able to create code review experiences that would work with a number of providers. But we started with GitHub so that we could self-host on our own extension. So in April of this year, we started building a prototype of this extension. And Sarah's team reached out to us at this time, and we met and demoed our prototype. Sarah's team showed all of the work they'd done on Visual Studio, and we realized that we were really working towards a common goal. So from that point onward, all of our effort on the extension was joint effort. To actually build the extension, we reused a number of VS Code's APIs, but we also created new API. So I want to talk a bit about that process. First, what was the existing API we could use? For the GitHub pull requests view, we use the tree data provider API. Most of the APIs within VS Code are a data provider model. That is, the extension provides data to VS Code, and VS Code is responsible for determining the view and actually rendering this data. This is in contrast to the web view, which is what we used for the description page. With this API, the extension can completely control what UI is shown within the editor. So for the description page, we wanted this to be specific and custom to GitHub, which is why we went with the web view API here. So then what was the missing piece of API? As we began developing and prototyping the extension, we realized that there was a real gap around commenting. We couldn't cobble together any existing APIs to create a good experience for this. More importantly, we realized that commenting would be a really killer feature to have in VS Code. We could see this being used in a broad range of extensions. Anything related to code review and code collaboration could make use of this API. So the next question was, how much control does the extension have over what a comment looks like? Is this a data provider model, or is this more like a web view? And we went back and forth on this. But ultimately, we decided that this should be a data provider. So first, we wanted to make sure that comments would be consistent across extensions. We didn't want users to have different experiences with different commenting extensions. So comments should have both consistent UI and behavior. Thinking back to the demo, we had added this command enter shortcut. We wouldn't want each individual extension to come up with its own shortcut for this. Instead, we want one editable key binding. Secondly, this is going directly into the editor. This is the most important part of VS Code. So we want to make sure that anything that gets contributed directly to the editor is not going to compromise its responsiveness, stability, or security. And so for that reason, we went with the data provider model. And this is what that API actually looks like. So when Peng and I first implemented this, it only had the ability to show comments and to add new comments. And so we created a version of this extension using that API and gave it out to the rest of the team to test. Every other person kept asking us, hey, how do I edit comments? To which we replied, just don't make mistakes. But in the last iteration, we've added support for editing and deleting comments. And this is still an evolving API. So within VS Code, we have two stages of API, proposed and stable. At the beginning of each iteration, we meet as a team to discuss all of the possible proposed APIs. This is an 8 a.m. call, since our team is split between Redmond and Zurich, so it can be a bit painful for us in Redmond. We continue to iterate on the proposed API throughout that iteration and in future iterations. And at some point, we'll decide that the API is completely rock solid and unlikely to change in the future. And at that point, the API is promoted to stable. Currently, the comments provider API is in a proposed state. So there are still things we'd like to add to it and possible refinements we could make. But working on the API isn't the only thing we plan to do with the extension. So I'll turn it back over to Sarah to talk more about our next steps.
So what's next for our extension? Well, we're already working on showing compliance status and supporting submodules inside of Visual Studio Code. We have a create pull request experience that is an open PR right now, about to be merged, so we're really excited about that. And right now, you can add in inline comments throughout your code and have that final comment with approve or request changes on the description page. But being able to lump them together into one review, like you can on github.com, is something that we're working towards. And then thinking about the future, I don't know if you saw the keynote yesterday, but suggested changes inside of your editor could be even more powerful than it is on .com. By having the ability to actually test those suggested changes before you make that suggestion, we think that that's a really powerful feature that we're working towards. And eventually moving on to the GraphQL API, which is GitHub's V4 API. If you come away from this talk with one thing, just remember this one website, vscode.github.com. Because from here, just
Other way.
From here, you can see. From here, you can access the extension from the VS Code Marketplace. You can quickly get to the open source repository. You can open up an issue here, or better yet, close one out and contribute. And you can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Twitter, and we also run usability research studies for all of our editor extensions, and we'd love to have you participate so that we can understand your unique developer workflow and see if we can better support it. So once again, if you're around Universe, feel free to stop by the VS Code booth up at the Microsoft section on the second floor. Find one of the 4 of us around and ask us questions. Engage with us on Twitter or join our repository. We'd love to see you there. Thank you.